I should have known something was wrong the moment my father smiled at dinner. Victor Hart didn't smile unless he was closing a deal, and that night, seated at the mahogany table in my grandfather's Magnolia Boulevard estate, his lips curved like a fisherman's hook baited with false warmth. The chandelier above us cast fractured light across the bone china, and I watched my grandfather, Thaddeus, cut into his salmon with the same deliberate precision he'd used to build Hart Maritime from a single tugboat into Seattle's most respected shipping company. At 87, his hands still held steady, his eyes still missed nothing. Across from him, my father leaned back in his chair with calculated ease, swirling his wine. "You know, Dad," Victor began, his voice honeyed with concern, "we should really talk about your health. You're not getting any younger, and with the business, the properties, all these assets, we need to think about succession planning, estate management. It would give you peace of mind." My stepmother Serafina nodded, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the tablecloth. She'd married my father 3 years ago, and from the moment she'd walked into our lives with her practiced smile and designer wardrobe, I'd felt the temperature in the family drop several degrees. Now her eyes flicked to my grandfather with barely concealed contempt, as if his continued existence was an inconvenience to her plans. Thaddeus set down his fork with a soft click that somehow echoed through the dining room. "Victor," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent commanding respect on docks and boardrooms alike. "When I built this company, I didn't have a trust fund to fall back on. I had calloused hands and a willingness to work 18-hour days in weather that would send you crying to your heated car. I'm not sure what succession you think you're ready for, but from where I'm sitting, you've yet to demonstrate you can manage anything more complex than your golf handicap." The air crystallized. I saw my father's jaw tighten, the muscle jumping beneath his skin. For a moment, I thought he might actually lose his composure, but he recovered quickly, laughing it off as if it were a joke between them. It wasn't. Nothing between my father and grandfather had been a joke for years, not since Victor had begun eyeing the family fortune, with the desperation of a man drowning in debts no one was supposed to know about. But I knew. I'd seen the collection notices he'd hastily hidden when I'd stopped by his downtown condo unannounced. I'd noticed how his hand shook slightly when his phone rang with numbers he didn't recognize. My father had demons, and they wore the face of every casino from Vegas to Macau, where he'd tried to prove he was more than just a shipping heir living in his father's considerable shadow. "I'm just saying," Victor continued, his voice tighter now, "it would be wise to get things in order. Transfer some assets, set up protections. For tax purposes, you understand. For your legacy." Thaddeus studied him for a long moment, and I saw something flicker in my grandfather's eyes. Recognition, disappointment, perhaps even pity. "My legacy," he said slowly, "is not measured in how cleverly I avoid responsibility to the society that built the infrastructure for my success. My legacy is in the men who work those ships, who come home safe to their families because Hart Maritime doesn't cut corners. That's a legacy you can't transfer with a signature, son." The spoon hit the table with such force that I jumped. Victor's face had gone red, his carefully maintained facade cracking like cheap veneer. "I'm trying to help you," he hissed, before catching himself. He forced his features back into something resembling calm, but his eyes blazed with fury. "I apologize. I just want what's best for the family." After dinner, I found my father in the hallway, loosening his tie with sharp, agitated movements. "Dad," I said quietly, "what's really going on?" He turned to me, and for a moment, I saw something raw and desperate in his expression. Then it vanished, replaced by the cold dismissal I'd come to know so well. "Eleanor, you should worry about your own future instead of inserting yourself into matters you don't understand. This is business. Adult business." The condescension in his voice stung, but it was familiar. I'd spent 32 years being my father's daughter, and I'd learned that love in the Hart family came with conditions. Be quiet. Be pretty. Be convenient. Don't ask questions that make powerful men uncomfortable. 3 weeks later, my father announced a trip to Lisbon. A chance to reconnect. He told me over coffee at the Starbucks near my Capitol Hill apartment. Dad's been talking about Portugal for years, about the time he spent there as a young merchant marine. I thought it would be nice, 3 generations exploring his old haunts. You, me, him, quality time. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe that somewhere beneath the mounting debts and the barely concealed resentment, my father still had the capacity for genuine affection, for the kind of filial love that didn't come with a price tag. So I said yes. The morning we left, I noticed my father's nervous energy, the way he kept checking his phone, the tight set of his shoulders. At SeaTac Airport, I caught sight of 2 men who seemed to be tracking our movements, their eyes following my grandfather with unsettling focus. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few quick photos, something twisting uneasily in my stomach. On the plane, while Victor dozed in first class and Serafina scrolled through shopping websites, my grandfather leaned close to me. His breath smelled of peppermint, and his eyes held a clarity that belied his age. From his jacket pocket, He produced a small USB drive, pressing it into my palm with surprising urgency. "Eleanor," he whispered, "if anything happens, open the shadow file. Just type that into the password prompt. Shadow file. Can you remember that?" "Grandpa, what?" He pressed a finger to his lips, then winked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mischief? Resignation? Preparation for something I couldn't yet fathom? Before I could ask more, he'd settled back into his seat, pulling a maritime history book onto his lap as if nothing had happened. Lisbon was beautiful in the way cities built on 7 hills always are, all terracotta roofs and pastel facades climbing toward a sky the color of forget-me-nots. We spent the first day touring the Alfama district, my grandfather's eyes bright with recognition as he pointed out bars where he'd drunk vinho verde with other young sailors, streets where he'd walked with a Portuguese girl whose name he'd never forgotten. It was on our second day, at the Belém Tower, that everything shattered. We'd separated briefly, Thaddeus wanting to walk along the waterfront, while Victor and Serafina claimed they needed to make some calls. I wandered through the tower's limestone chambers, imagining the age of discovery, when ships like the ones my grandfather would later command had set out from this very shore to map the world. When I emerged 20 minutes later, my grandfather was gone. Not just gone, abandoned. I found him sitting on a bench near the water, his face pale, his hands empty. No wallet, no passport. No phone. Just an old man in a foreign country, stripped of everything that proved he existed, that gave him the means to return home. "Eleanor," he said when he saw me, and his voice held something I'd never heard from him before. Fear. "Your father. He said he needed my documents for something at the embassy, that there was an issue with our return flights. He took everything. And then he left." My hands shook as I pulled out my phone, dialing my father's number. It rang once, twice, and then his voice, tight with something ugly. "Don't call me, Eleanor. This is for the best. He's had his time. Now it's ours." "Dad, what are you talking about? You left him here. You took his passport, his money, everything." "I left an old man who's too stubborn to see reason. Maybe a few days alone will teach him the value of family cooperation, of knowing when to step aside." The line went dead. I stood there, the Portuguese sun beating down on my shoulders, staring at my phone screen as if it could somehow unsay what I'd just heard. My father had abandoned his own father in a foreign country. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. This was cruelty weaponized as leverage. The next hours blurred into a nightmare of bureaucracy and desperation. I got us to the U.S. Embassy, where a kind consular officer listened to our story with a professionally sympathetic expression that told me she'd heard worse. She couldn't issue an emergency passport immediately, couldn't just wave us through, but she could start the process. It would take days, maybe a week. In a small office that smelled of coffee and anxiety, a man I'd never seen before approached me. He was Portuguese, maybe 60, with kind eyes and a slight limp. "Senhora Hart," he said quietly, "your grandfather asked me to give you this if anything happened." He handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a satellite phone, the kind used by ships at sea where normal signals couldn't reach, and a single piece of paper with a phone number and a name, Lena. Beneath that, in my grandfather's careful script, "Don't worry, everything is going according to plan. Call her." My hands were still shaking when I dialed the number. It rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered, crisp and professional. "Lena Reeves, you must be Eleanor. How did you—" "Your grandfather is a careful man, Miss Hart. He sent me an encrypted email 2 weeks ago, triggered to decrypt yesterday at noon. I've been expecting your call. Where are you?" I told her everything, the words tumbling out in a rush, the dinner conversation, the trip, the abandonment. The growing certainty that my father's plans went far beyond leaving an old man stranded in Portugal. There was a pause, and then Lena's voice came back, harder now, purposeful. "I'm opening the file now. Oh, this is comprehensive. Your grandfather has been documenting everything, Eleanor. Everything." "What do you mean, everything?" "I mean your father's gambling debts, $340,000 to various casinos, 2 of them offshore operations that are decidedly not legal. I mean property transfer documents that your father forged, attempting to move assets out of your grandfather's name. I mean video footage from a Starbucks on 4th Avenue showing Victor pressuring Thaddeus to sign paperwork with a notary named Paul Sloan who's about to have a very bad day. Your grandfather has been building a case, Eleanor. He's been waiting for your father to show his true colors." The satellite phone felt heavy in my hand. Why didn't he stop him? Why let it get this far? "Because," Lena said softly, "he needed to know if your father would actually go through with it. He needed to see if there was anything worth saving, and he needed to give you a choice. Your grandfather loves you, Eleanor. He wants you to make your own decision about what comes next, so you never have to wonder if you were just following orders." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "If you want the old man to make it home safely, don't interfere. This is family business." I stared at those words, feeling something cold and bright crystallize in my chest. This was family business, and I was about to handle it. I texted back, "He's already not safe. He's stranded in a foreign country because of you. Whatever you did, whoever you threatened, it ends now." 3 days later, through a combination of emergency documentation, Lena's legal maneuvering, and my grandfather's connections with people who still respected the man he'd been and the company he'd built, we were on a private plane back to Seattle. Not the commercial flight Victor had booked. Not the route he'd expect. A sleek Gulfstream arranged by Thaddeus's security team, men who looked like they'd spent time in places where asking questions could get you killed. My grandfather spent the flight making phone calls, his voice low and purposeful. I dozed fitfully, dreaming of drowning, of reaching for hands that pulled away at the last moment. We landed at Boeing Field just after midnight on a Tuesday. Seattle spread below us in a carpet of lights, the sound a dark ribbon dividing the city from the islands beyond. Home. Except it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a battlefield. The first thing Thaddeus had done, I learned during the flight, was change every lock in the estate. New security system. New cameras, hidden in the crown molding and light fixtures, streaming everything to a cloud server that Victor couldn't access. He'd left one entrance open, a side door near the winter garden that only Eleanor and he knew about, the one I'd used as a teenager when I'd sneaked out to meet friends my father didn't approve of. We entered like thieves in our own home, the absurdity not lost on me. The house was dark, but I could hear voices from upstairs. Victor and Serafina had made themselves comfortable, it seemed. I followed my grandfather through the familiar halls, past the study where he'd taught me to tie nautical knots, past the library where we'd read together on rainy afternoons. In the morning, I watched from the kitchen window as my father's Mercedes pulled into the circular driveway. He looked pleased with himself, confident in a way that made my stomach turn. He tried the front door. Locked. The side entrance. Locked. I saw confusion flicker across his face, then irritation, then something darker. The doorbell rang, sharp and insistent. I opened it. The look on Victor's face when he saw me was almost worth the 3 days of hell in Portugal. Almost. Confusion gave way to shock, and then something like fear as my grandfather stepped into view behind me, very much not stranded on another continent. "Oh," Thaddeus said mildly, leaning on his cane. "You're back, Victor. How was your trip? I trust you enjoyed Lisbon without the burden of your elderly father slowing you down." Victor's mouth opened and closed. Serafina, standing behind him in a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, had gone pale. "Thaddeus?" My father finally managed. "How did you— We thought you had food poisoning, that you needed to stay at the hotel, that it was better if we came home and arranged proper care." "Food poisoning." My voice surprised me with its steadiness. "Is that the story you're going with, Dad?" "Not the truth, which is that you abandoned your father in a foreign country, took his passport, his money, his phone, and left him at the Belém Tower like he was trash you were done with?" Serafina stepped forward, her face twisting with indignation. "You have no right to speak to your father that way, Eleanor. You don't understand the complexities." The crack of my grandfather's cane against the marble floor silenced her. "This is my house, Serafina. My rules. The first of which is that gold diggers don't lecture my granddaughter about respect." "You can't lock us out," Victor said, his voice rising. "I have legal rights to this property. I'm your son. I'm a co-owner." "Are you?" I pulled out my phone, pressing record. "This is Washington State, Dad. Single-party consent for recording. I'm notifying you now that this conversation is being documented." I set the phone on the hall table, the red light blinking. "Now, would you like to explain to the recording why you think you have ownership rights to property that's titled solely in Thaddeus Hart's name, or would you like to explain these?" I spread papers across the entry table. Property transfer documents. The ones Victor had forged, the ones that would have moved the estate, the company's shares, everything, into his name. The ones that were so blatantly fraudulent that even a first-year law student could spot the problems. The ones that were, nonetheless, already filed with various real estate and title companies, setting the stage for a theft so brazen it took my breath away. "I found these," I continued, "when I accessed the file Grandpa left for me, along with your gambling debts. $340,000, Dad, to casinos that aren't exactly legal. To loan sharks who don't take checks." "How were you planning to pay them back?" "Oh, right. By stealing your father's life's work." Victor's face had gone from pale to red to an alarming shade of purple. "You have no idea what you're talking about. Those documents were for estate planning, for tax purposes." "Then why?" Thaddeus interrupted, his voice quiet and terrible. "Did you not tell me about them? Why forge my signature? Why use a notary who, I'm told, has quite the sideline in fraudulent document certification?" The sound of car engines made us all turn. 3 black SUVs pulled through the gate, moving with the deliberate precision of law enforcement. They parked in a semicircle, and I watched as several people emerged. Men and women in suits, moving with the confidence of federal agents. Leading them was a woman in her early 40s, black, with close-cropped hair and eyes that missed nothing. She approached the door, holding up credentials. Oza Haynes, United States Attorney's Office, Western District of Washington. We're here regarding a complaint of elder financial abuse and interstate fraud. Mr. Hart, I'm going to need you to preserve all documents and communications related to property transfers, asset management, and financial transactions involving Thaddeus Hart. Victor looked like he might be sick. This is insane. I'm his son. This is a family matter. Elder abuse is a federal crime when it involves financial exploitation and crosses state lines, Mr. Hart. The fact that you abandoned your father in Portugal after attempting to coerce him into signing fraudulent documents makes this very much our business. Haynes turned to my grandfather. Mr. Hart, we've reviewed the initial evidence your attorney submitted. We'll need your full cooperation, but I want you to know we take these matters seriously. I appreciate that, Miss Haynes. My grandfather gestured toward the door. Perhaps we should discuss this inside. I have quite a bit to show you. The next hour felt surreal. We sat in my grandfather's study, the room where I'd always felt safest, and watched as decades of carefully curated evidence unspooled. Thaddeus had been preparing for this for months, maybe longer. Every conversation, every attempt by Victor to manipulate him into signing away his assets, every threat, every pressure tactic. Recorded, documented, time-stamped. The video from Starbucks was the worst. I watched my father lean across a small table, his face twisted with frustration, as he pushed papers toward my grandfather. You're being unreasonable. Victor hissed on the recording. You're old. You're losing it. Just sign the damn papers and make this easy on everyone. The notary, Paul Sloan, sat beside them, counting cash. $200 in 20s, payment for a signature that would legitimize fraud. Serafina sat rigid beside my father, her face carefully blank, but I saw her hands shake. She'd known. Of course she'd known. She'd probably helped plan it. Then came the final revelation, the one that made even Prosecutor Haynes pause. My grandfather reached into his desk and pulled out a folder, legal-sized, bursting with documents. I want to show you something, he said, looking directly at Victor. This is the Thorne Family Trust, established 3 months ago, irrevocable. He slid the papers across the desk. I leaned in to read, my heart hammering. Every tangible asset, everything Victor had been trying to steal, had been transferred into a charitable trust. The estate, the island cabin, the controlling shares in Hart Maritime, all of it, locked away in a foundation dedicated to maritime education scholarships. Thaddeus retained lifetime use rights. After his death, I would become the trust administrator. Victor would receive a salary as CEO of Hart Maritime, contingent on performance and compliance with federal labor and safety regulations. But the assets themselves? Untouchable. You bastard, Victor whispered, the word barely audible. You'd rather give it to strangers than to your own son? Strangers won't abandon me in Lisbon. Thaddeus replied, his voice steady. Strangers won't forge my signature. And strangers will remember what it means to respect the sea and the people who work it. Haynes stood, gathering her materials. We'll be in touch about scheduling formal interviews. Mr. Victor Hart, you should consult with an attorney. These are serious allegations, and while we're not filing charges today, I want to be clear that this investigation is ongoing. After they left, after Victor and Serafina had stormed out with threats of countersuits and accusations of manipulation, after the house fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, I sat with Thaddeus in his study and finally let myself cry. I loved him, I said, the words breaking. I know he's flawed. I know he's weak, but he's my father. I loved him, and he was willing to destroy you to pay his debts, to fund his addiction. How do I come back from knowing that? Thaddeus took my hand, his grip still strong. You don't come back from it, Eleanor. You go forward. You accept that people are capable of disappointing us in ways we never imagined. And you decide who you're going to be despite that disappointment. The legal battle that followed was brutal. Victor hired Robert Michaels, a lawyer with a reputation for aggressive tactics and courtroom theatrics. Michaels attempted to paint my grandfather as a vindictive old man punishing his son for imagined slights. He brought in psychiatrists who'd never met Thaddeus to testify about diminished capacity and susceptibility to manipulation by younger family members. He tried to suggest that I had orchestrated everything, that I'd poisoned my grandfather's mind against his own son. Our attorney, Margaret Chen, was a different breed entirely. 55, with silver-streaked hair and a way of speaking that made judges lean forward to listen, she dismantled every argument with surgical precision. She presented the videos, the forged documents, the testimony of Paul Sloan, who'd cracked under federal pressure and admitted to notarizing dozens of fraudulent transfers. I had to testify. Sitting in that courtroom, with Victor staring at me from the defendant's table and Serafina radiating hatred from the gallery, I told the truth. I described Lisbon, the phone call, finding my grandfather abandoned. I described years of watching my father's addiction spiral, of enabling his behavior because I didn't want to believe my own parent could be so lost. Did you love your father? Michaels asked on cross-examination, his tone dripping with false sympathy. Yes, I said. I still do. That's why this is so hard. That's why knowing he was willing to destroy his own father, to steal everything Grandpa built, hurts so much. Love doesn't disappear just because someone betrays you. It just becomes this thing you carry, this weight that never quite goes away. The judge, Isabella Rossi, took 3 days to issue her ruling. When she finally did, her voice was firm and uncompromising. The evidence of fraud, coercion, and elder abuse is overwhelming. All property transfer documents executed under duress or through fraudulent means are hereby voided. Full ownership reverts to Thaddeus Hart. Furthermore, Victor Hart is enjoined from coming within 500 yards of his father's residence or business premises without prior court approval. Victor's face crumpled. For just a moment, I saw past the anger and entitlement to the broken man beneath, the one who'd never been able to live up to his father's legacy and had decided that if he couldn't earn it, he'd simply take it. But then my grandfather did something I didn't expect. 2 weeks after the trial ended, he called a meeting at Hart Maritime's headquarters. The conference room overlooked Elliott Bay, and through the windows, I could see container ships moving slowly toward the docks, the same ships that had built our family's fortune. Victor was there, looking gaunt and nervous. Serafina wasn't. She'd filed for divorce 3 days after the verdict, already moving on to her next mark. I'm appointing you CEO, Thaddeus said without preamble. Victor's head snapped up. What? CEO of Hart Maritime. 6-month probationary period. You'll work under a compliance monitor and with a union liaison. You'll earn a salary, not an executive package. You'll pay back the wages you cut from workers during your last stint in management, and you'll prove that you can run a shipping company without treating it like your personal piggy bank. Why? Victor's voice cracked. Why would you do this after everything? Because you're my son, Thaddeus said simply. Because walking away is easy, and I've never been interested in easy. You want the company? Earn it. Learn what it actually takes to keep ships maintained, crews safe, and clients satisfied. Learn that a legacy isn't something you inherit. It's something you build every single day with hard work and integrity. I watched my father grapple with this, with the reality that he was being handed not a prize but a test, one he might very well fail. But I also saw something else flicker in his eyes. Something that might have been hope, or maybe just exhaustion, with being the villain of his own story. The months that followed were hard. Victor struggled with the complexity of actually running Hart Maritime rather than just skimming profits from it. He dealt with Coast Guard inspections, insurance audits, contract negotiations with unions who didn't trust him. He learned the names of the crews, attended safety briefings at dawn, spent nights reviewing maintenance schedules instead of sitting at blackjack tables. I kept my distance, but I watched. I watched him start to pay off his debts, 20,000 here, 10,000 there, the kind of slow, grinding progress that couldn't be rushed. I watched him attend Gamblers Anonymous meetings, his car parked in the church lot every Thursday evening. I watched him begin to look less like a con man running a scam and more like a man trying desperately not to drown. On Thanksgiving, he showed up at the estate. I answered the door, and for a long moment, we just looked at each other. He'd lost weight. There were new lines around his eyes. I can't fix what I did in Lisbon, he said finally. I can't take back abandoning Dad, or the lies, or the forged documents. I know that. But I'm trying to become someone who wouldn't do those things, someone your grandfather might have actually wanted to hire. I didn't step aside immediately. You burned the bridge, Dad. If you want to rebuild it, you're going to have to do it from your end. I'm not meeting you halfway. Not yet. He nodded, the old arrogance gone, replaced by something more human, more real. Fair enough. A week later, Prosecutor Haynes called. We're offering your father a deal. Full restitution to affected employees, a substantial donation to the Maritime Scholarship Fund, 6 months of supervised community service with Hart Maritime operating under federal compliance monitoring. In exchange, we'll recommend probation rather than prison time. He has to admit wrongdoing. He has to accept responsibility. But if he completes the terms, he can avoid a felony conviction. What do you recommend? I asked. I recommend redemption over revenge, Haynes said. We're in the business of justice, not just punishment. If he can make amends, if he can contribute rather than destroy, that serves everyone better than him sitting in a cell. Victor took the deal. On a cold December morning, I sat in federal court and watched my father stand before a judge and admit everything. The gambling, the fraud, the abandonment, the desperate, ugly things he'd done to try to escape consequences of his own making. His voice broke several times, but he got through it. Afterward, in the courthouse hallway, he approached me cautiously. I heard about the scholarship, he said. The Thorne Family Maritime Education Fund. Your grandfather named it after his mother's maiden name. He wanted it to be about the people who actually work the sea, I said, not about Hart family ego. I want to contribute, not for credit, not for publicity. I just want to be part of something that matters. I studied him, this man who'd given me life, and then tried to destroy the person who taught me what life should mean. Then write the check with work, Dad. Write it every day by showing up, by making the company something that keeps people safe and treats them fairly. That's the contribution that matters. He nodded slowly. That's all I've been writing lately. By spring, things had settled into a new normal. Victor remained CEO, but his role was earned now rather than assumed. The crews respected him in a way they never had before, because he'd learned their names, learned their concerns, actually listened when they talked about equipment failures or safety protocols that needed updating. My grandfather and I spent weekends in his winter garden, planting cold hardy flowers that would bloom even when the frost came. Pansies and primrose, resilient things that knew how to survive in harsh conditions. Do you regret the trust? I asked him one Saturday, my hands deep in soil that smelled of earth and possibility. Giving it all away instead of keeping it in the family? The family has it, Thaddeus said. The family of people who understand what the sea demands, what it teaches. Victor will either learn that or he won't. But either way, the company will go on. The scholarships will help kids who dream of ships and far horizons. That's a legacy I can be proud of. I thought about that, about how we choose what to pass on, not just money or property, but values, ethics, the understanding that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. My father never moved back into the estate. He got a small apartment near the waterfront, the kind of place a working CEO might actually choose rather than a mansion meant to impress. He came for dinner sometimes, but the easy intimacy we'd once shared was gone, replaced by something more cautious, more honest. On the first anniversary of the Lisbon incident, he showed up at the door holding a navy blue cap, the kind worn by Hart Maritime captains. I heard the scholarship program graduated its first recipients, he said. 3 kids starting as deckhands next month. I wanted to bring this for the company ceremony. Thought you should be the one to present it to them. Why me? I asked. Because you're the one who actually gave a damn about the legacy, he said. You're the one who stood up when it mattered. You should be the one to hand it forward. I took the cap, feeling the weight of it in my hands. Not heavy, but significant. You could do it too, you know, if you keep showing up, if you keep choosing to be better. I'm working on it, he said. One day at a time. That's all I've got. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It wasn't complete forgiveness or restoration of everything that had been broken. But it was movement. It was the possibility of redemption, earned through consistent action rather than granted as a gift. I stood in my grandfather's house, the house that would one day belong to a foundation dedicated to education and opportunity, and I understood something fundamental. Family wasn't just about blood. It wasn't about obligations or inherited rights. It was about showing up, even when showing up was hard. It was about choosing every day to be worthy of the love offered to you. My father was trying to make that choice now. Whether he would succeed was still uncertain, but at least he was trying, and that was more than he'd done in years. Outside, Seattle rain began to fall, soft and persistent, the kind of rain that nourishes rather than destroys. I watched it through the window and thought about seeds planted in winter soil, about how sometimes you have to let things die back completely before new growth can begin. The harbor's reckoning had come. Justice had been served, not perfectly, but adequately. And somewhere in the space between punishment and forgiveness, between the people we'd been and the people we were trying to become, we were all learning what it meant to build rather than take, to earn rather than inherit, to respect the legacy we'd been given by actually becoming worthy of it. It was enough, not everything, but enough. And in the end, enough was the only thing worth reaching for. The first scholarship ceremony took place in June, held at the Hart Maritime offices overlooking Elliott Bay. The 3 recipients stood nervously in their new deck uniforms, young people with calloused hands and dreams of horizons. Thaddeus gave a brief speech about the sea's lessons, about how it teaches humility and respect faster than any classroom ever could. Then he handed me the microphone. I looked out at the assembled crowd, current Hart Maritime employees, union representatives, local maritime industry leaders, and my father, standing near the back of the room with his hands clasped in front of him like a man in church. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw something there I hadn't seen in years. Pride. Not in himself, but in what we were building together, in what was emerging from the wreckage of his worst choices. My grandfather built Hart Maritime with the understanding that the sea doesn't care about your last name or your bank account. I began, my voice steadier than I expected. It only cares whether you know your job and whether you'll stand by your crew when things get rough. These scholarships exist because we believe that opportunity should be based on merit and dedication, not inheritance. That the next generation of maritime professionals should include people who truly love the work, not just the status it might bring. I presented each recipient with their captain's cap and a handshake, and as I did, I felt my grandfather's hand on my shoulder, a gentle pressure that communicated everything words couldn't. This was what legacy looked like. Not mansions or stock portfolios, but young people getting chances they'd earned, getting to chase dreams that might otherwise have remained forever out of reach. After the ceremony, while people mingled over coffee and pastries, my father approached the scholarship recipients. I watched from across the room as he spoke with them, asking about their backgrounds, their goals, their understanding of what they were getting into. One of them, a young woman named Maria Rodriguez, showed him her acceptance letter, her face glowing with excitement. Victor read it carefully, then said something that made her laugh, the kind of genuine laugh that suggested he'd made an actual human connection rather than just going through the motions. When he caught me watching, he excused himself and made his way over. We stood together at the window, looking out at the container ships moving through the gray-blue water. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not shutting me out completely, for leaving the door open even when I didn't deserve it." I considered my response carefully. "I didn't do it for you, Dad. I did it because Grandpa taught me that people are capable of change if they want it badly enough. And because I needed to know I'd tried, even if you didn't." "I know," he took a breath. "I've been seeing a therapist. Court-ordered at first, but I'm continuing anyway." She asked me what I was most afraid of, and I realized it was becoming invisible, irrelevant. Dad built something so massive, so successful, and I could never figure out how to be anything but the son who couldn't measure up. So I tried to take shortcuts, tried to buy respect with money I didn't have, tried to claim what I hadn't earned. "And now?" I asked. "Now I'm learning that there are no shortcuts, that showing up every day and doing the work is the only path that matters. It's not glamorous. Half the time it's boring as hell, but it's real, and that's something I haven't been in a very long time." Before I could respond, Thaddeus joined us, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose body no longer kept pace with his mind. "Victor," he said, "the union rep wants to discuss the new safety protocols with you. Something about updated training requirements for the crane operators." My father nodded. "I'll handle it." He paused, then added, "Thank you for trusting me with this, Dad. I know I haven't earned that trust yet, but I'm trying." "I can see that," Thaddeus replied. "Keep trying." We watched Victor walk across the room, stopping to shake hands with several employees who greeted him with cautious respect. Not the fawning deference he'd once demanded, but something more genuine. "Do you think he'll make it?" I asked my grandfather. "I think," Thaddeus said slowly, "that he has a fighting chance, which is more than he had when he was sitting in casinos at 3 a.m, telling himself the next hand would fix everything. People can change, Eleanor, but only if they're willing to look honestly at who they've been and decide to become someone different. Your father is doing that work now. Whether he succeeds or fails, at least he's finally doing it." The summer passed into autumn, and the rhythms of the new normal settled in. Victor continued as CEO, and under his management, Hart Maritime began to shift, not dramatically, but incrementally. Safety protocols were updated and actually enforced. Employee benefits improved slightly. The company took on fewer high-risk contracts and focused on building relationships with clients who valued quality over rock-bottom prices. I took on a role as trust administrator, learning the maritime business from the inside. Thaddeus taught me how to read shipping manifests, how to evaluate crew performance reports, how to balance profitability with safety and ethics. It was challenging work, and I loved it in a way I'd never loved my previous career in marketing. There was something deeply satisfying about building something real, something that kept people employed and safe, something that mattered beyond quarterly profit margins. In October, I received a phone call from Prosecutor Haynes. "I wanted to update you on your father's case," she said. "He's completed his supervised community service requirement. The compliance monitor reports that he's been exceptionally cooperative, transparent with all financial records, and has made full restitution to affected employees. The court is satisfied with his progress." "What does that mean for him?" I asked. "It means that when his probationary period ends in 3 months, assuming he continues on this trajectory, the case will be closed. No felony conviction, a chance to move forward without that weight." I felt a complex swirl of emotions, relief, cautious hope, and underneath it all, a lingering sadness for all the pain that could have been avoided if my father had chosen differently years ago. "Thank you for letting me know." "Eleanor," Haynes said, her voice softer now, "I've been doing this work for 15 years. And I can count on one hand the number of times I've seen someone truly turn their life around after elder abuse charges. Your father is doing the work. Give him credit for that, even if the wounds are still fresh." After we hung up, I sat in my office at Hart Maritime and looked at the photo on my desk. It had been taken at the scholarship ceremony, and it showed 3 generations of Harts. Thaddeus with his hand on my shoulder, me in the middle, and Victor standing slightly apart but present, his expression unguarded for once. We looked like what we were, a family that had been broken and was slowly, painfully, learning how to function again. That evening, I drove to my father's apartment. It was a modest place in Ballard, nothing like the luxury condo he'd lost when he'd sold everything to pay his debts. I knocked, and he answered wearing jeans and a Hart Maritime polo shirt, his reading glasses perched on his head. "Eleanor," he said, surprised. "Is everything okay?" "I heard from Prosecutor Haynes. About your progress." He nodded slowly. "I've been trying to follow the terms to the letter. It's not about avoiding consequences anymore. It's about actually earning back some semblance of respect." "Can I come in?" His apartment was sparse but clean. Books about maritime management on the coffee table. A wall calendar marked with work schedules and AA meetings. No signs of the excess that had once defined his life. We sat across from each other, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I said, "I don't know if I can fully forgive you for Lisbon, for what you tried to do to Grandpa, but I can acknowledge that you're trying to be better, and I think that's worth something." His eyes filled with tears. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know that every day I wake up and remember what I did. And I use that memory as motivation to be someone different. Someone who doesn't abandon the people who love him. Someone who builds instead of destroying." "Then keep doing that," I said. "Keep showing up. Keep making the hard choices. And maybe someday, the distance between us will feel less like a canyon and more like something we can bridge." "Thank you," he whispered. "That's more than I deserve." "Probably," I agreed. "But Grandpa taught me that grace isn't about what people deserve. It's about what we choose to offer even when it's hard." As I drove home through Seattle's evening traffic, rain beginning to streak my windshield, I thought about the journey we'd all taken. From that terrible dinner where Victor had first revealed his intentions, through the nightmare of Lisbon, the legal battles, the slow process of accountability and change. It hadn't been a straight line toward healing. It had been messy and painful and full of setbacks. But it had been real. Christmas that year was different. We gathered at the estate, but it was smaller, quieter. Just Thaddeus, Victor, and me. Lena joined us for dinner, as did Margaret Chen, who'd become more friend than attorney over the months. We didn't pretend that everything was perfect, that the wounds had fully healed. But we shared a meal, told stories about the company's history, laughed at some of Thaddeus's more outrageous sailing adventures. After dinner, my father presented Thaddeus with a gift. It was a model ship, painstakingly detailed, a replica of the first tugboat my grandfather had captained. "I made it myself," Victor said. "Took me 3 months of evenings. I figured it was time I learned what it actually takes to build something, rather than just trying to claim credit for other people's work." Thaddeus examined the model carefully, running his fingers over the tiny rigging, the perfectly scaled deck. "This is fine work, son. Really fine." "I had a lot of time to think while I was building it," Victor said. "About patience. About how anything worth having takes time and attention, and a willingness to start over when you mess up. I messed up a lot on this, had to rebuild the mast twice, but I kept at it. That's what matters," Thaddeus replied. "Not getting it right the first time, keeping at it until you do." Later, standing on the terrace overlooking the Sound, wrapped in a blanket against the December cold, I watched lights from distant ships moving through the darkness. My grandfather joined me, moving slowly, his cane tapping against the stone. "Are you happy with how things turned out?" I asked him. He considered the question. "Happy isn't quite the right word. Satisfied, maybe. I didn't want to destroy Victor. I wanted to save him from himself, from the worst parts of his nature. I think we're getting there. Slowly, but getting there. It was brutal, though, the whole process. There were times I wasn't sure any of us would survive it intact." "Growth usually is brutal," Thaddeus said. "The sea teaches you that. You either learn to respect it, to work with its rhythms instead of fighting them, or you drown." Victor was drowning. We threw him a line, but he had to be the one to grab it. He had to be the one to pull himself up. And if he hadn't? Then we would have grieved for the man he could have been, and moved forward anyway. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, Eleanor. The most you can do is offer the opportunity and hope they're ready to take it. A cargo ship moved through the darkness below, its navigation lights bright against the black water. I thought about all the people aboard, doing their jobs, trusting that the vessel was maintained, that the company cared about their safety, that someone was paying attention to more than just profit margins. "I think I'm finally understanding what you meant about legacy," I said. "It's not about leaving behind wealth or property. It's about leaving behind systems that work, values that endure, opportunities for people who come after us. The scholarship fund will keep helping young people long after we're all gone. The company standards we're setting will protect workers for decades. That's what matters." "You've learned well," Thaddeus said, and I heard the pride in his voice. "Better than I could have taught you if things had been easy. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that stick." We stood there in comfortable silence, watching the ships, the lights of Seattle spreading around us like a constellation come to Earth. Inside, I could hear my father's voice as he talked with Lena about some logistical challenge at the company. his tone engaged and thoughtful. Not the desperate, grasping man who'd abandoned his father in Portugal, but someone newer, someone still becoming. The journey wasn't over. There would be setbacks and struggles, moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves, but the trajectory had changed. We had chosen repair over abandonment, accountability over enablement, the hard work of restoration over the easier path of simply walking away. As the year turned and winter gave way to the first hints of spring, Hart Maritime continued to evolve. The second round of scholarship recipients was selected, and this time Victor was part of the interview panel, asking thoughtful questions about why these young people wanted to work in an industry that demanded so much and offered no guarantees. One afternoon in March, I found him in the company archives, surrounded by old logbooks and shipping records. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "Dad's early years," he replied. I realized I never actually knew his story. Not really. I knew he built the company, that he was successful, but I never understood what that actually meant. The 14-hour days, the close calls, the times he almost lost everything and had to start over. He held up a ledger from 1,978 pages filled with Thaddeus's careful handwriting. He was 35 here, same age I was when I first started gambling seriously, but he was building something, and I was tearing things down. "You're building now," I said gently. "I'm trying. Some days it feels impossible, like I've wasted too much time, made too many mistakes. But then I think about those scholarship kids, about how they're getting a chance because of what we're doing here, and it feels like maybe there's still time to leave behind something better than a cautionary tale." We worked together that afternoon, organizing the archives, piecing together the company's history. It felt like what it was, the beginning of something new, built on the foundation of hard lessons learned and a commitment to being better than we'd been. By summer, Victor had paid off all his gambling debts. He came to the estate to tell Thaddeus in person, and I watched through the study window as my father handed my grandfather the final proof of payment, then stood there, hands trembling slightly, waiting for a response. Thaddeus looked at the papers, then at his son, then pulled him into an embrace. They stood there for a long moment, two men who'd hurt each other badly but were finding their way back to something like understanding, not forgiveness perhaps, not yet, but acceptance of who they were now, who they were trying to become. That evening, the three of us sat in the winter garden, now lush with summer blooms. Roses and lavender, the scent thick and sweet in the warm air. We didn't talk much, just existed together in the space we'd created, hard-won and imperfect but real. "I've been thinking," Thaddeus said eventually, "about succession planning. Real succession planning, not the hostile takeover Victor attempted." We both looked at him, waiting. "When I die, Eleanor will manage the trust and the scholarship fund. That's settled. But Hart Maritime needs strong leadership, and I won't be here forever. Victor, you've done good work this past year. Hard work. If you can maintain this trajectory for another year, prove that it's not just performative change but real transformation, I want to officially name you CEO, not provisionally, fully. With my blessing." My father's face went through a series of emotions too complex to name. "I don't know if I've earned that yet," he said quietly. "You haven't," Thaddeus agreed, "but you're earning it now, every day. Every choice to show up, to do the work, to put the crew's safety ahead of your ego. That's what I'm looking for. That's what the company needs. Not someone perfect. Someone committed to doing better." "I won't let you down," Victor said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not again. See that you don't." As the sun set over the Sound, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the naive hope that believes everything will work out perfectly, but the hard-earned hope that understands the value of small victories, incremental progress, the daily choice to keep trying, even when it's difficult. My father would never be the man he could have been if he'd made better choices earlier. The years lost to addiction and entitlement couldn't be recovered. But he could be something else. A man who'd failed catastrophically, and then done the grinding work of rebuilding himself from the foundation up. A man who'd learned that legacy isn't stolen or inherited but earned through consistent action aligned with values. That was enough. Not perfect, but enough. The story of the Harts didn't end with redemption wrapped in a bow. It ended with work still to be done, relationships still healing, choices still to be made every day. But it ended with all of us moving forward together, carrying our scars but not letting them define us, building something that would outlast our individual lives and serve people we'd never meet. The sea had taught us its lessons, harsh and uncompromising, and we had learned, finally, to listen.